Hello and welcome to the Jazz History Database. My name is Professor Rich Falco. I'm Director of Jazz Studies at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Worcester, Mass., WPI, and founder and director of the Jazz History Database. Today is November 14, 2018. Every time I talk with today's guest, it seems I learn something new about him. His various projects have had a huge impact on the jazz world internationally. He's currently on the faculty of Jazz at Lincoln Center Swing University, where he teaches Jazz 101, 201, and 301. And he's an acclaimed author, researcher, historian, and lectures widely, especially in the area of free jazz, but is also an authority on many other styles and musicians. He was director of broadcasting and operations at WKCR Radio at Columbia University, an on-air host, as well as an engineer and producer. He's still on radio today and serves on-air host at WICN Radio, which is Jazz for New England. Today, I hope to discuss with him a somewhat complicated topic of reissued recordings. To say he's been immersed in this area of the music industry would be a gross understatement. By his own reckoning, he's been involved in about 800 to 1,000 reissues. And he was nominated for a Grammy for Best Historical Package in 2000, also 2006, and again in 2014. He received the Jazz Journalists Association Box Set Reissue of the Year Award in 2005. It's safe to say that today's jazz landscape would look quite different without the tremendous contributions of our guest. Please help me welcome to the Jazz History Database, Mr. Ben Young.
It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, as always.
Yeah, a second time.
Yeah.
And we get to see you quite a bit recently because you've been spending a lot of time in the Jazz History Database lab.
Also a pleasure for me.
So,
yeah.
Great. Well, welcome
Thank
for
you.
a second time. So let's get started.
Yes.
How do we untangle this whole idea of reissue? Is this catalog development? Is that how we look at it, as an umbrella? How does this whole thing work?
That's a thing, that is a phrase that I had to get used to, because when I started in this area of the music about 25 years ago, I used reissues kind of like you do to speak about the act of republishing anything that's been published before. And one of the guys who I worked for tightened me up on it and said, well, see, notice if you take an original record and reissue it, then that's a reissue. But there's other stuff you do that relates to music that has already been recorded that doesn't qualify as a reissue. Like, for instance, some of the things that I've done are older recordings that never were issued. So to put them out, it's not a re-anything, right? Furthermore, there's ways that you would take these three records and say, nobody wants to hear all of these three records. Let's get the greatest selection. So you make a sort of anthology, cherry picking a few from each of those and create a new compilation. And so that's actually a major act of what we call catalog development. That's not my phrase, but I'll stand under it and recommend it as a way to say something that's universally true that doesn't get us into trouble. And it's, some of you who are following the history of the music would know this act of how do you recirculate the jazz of the past has been a major factor going back into the 30s, really, and in our lifetimes, some of our lifetimes, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, every time there was a new format, there was a new consideration of how do you recycle the older stuff into the new format, and all of the above pertained. Some things that had never been issued would come out on LPs for the first time, despite having never had a previous history. Some things that were on LPs would get what we call a title reissue, where it's just the straight version of what it was, redone, maybe with some enhancements, and some would be sort of cherry-picked and resequenced, recombined, anthologized in some kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
So
I can recall some of my parents' 78s being reissued, if you will, but in stereo, because they were, of course, in mono initially when the stereos came out and all of that.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, with no offense to anybody who's a big fan of capitalism, it drives us to want to sell things over and over to the same people who have bought them before. Yeah. And the record business caught on to that real early. So if they could make a synthesized fake stereo version of it, they would. Or if they could get Duke Ellington to re-record in stereo, the things that had only been in mono, then that's another opportunity to resell some more stuff to your parents. So yes.
So you worked with Verve Records for quite a while, actually. I have it at 92 to 2001, something like that, and in a couple of different capacities. And then BMG. So let's talk about your relationship with, let's start with Verve and see, how did you get involved?
I was, one of my mentors, a guy whose name I might have called last time I was here, a cat called Phil Schaap, who's a radio guru and also a jazz historian. He sort of led me or invited me into a bunch of things. And when I got out of college, take note, when I got out of college, he was in the spot where he could say, hey, this industry needs some people who do what you do. Why don't you jump in and try your hand here? So I was hired in a freelance capacity, and then on some good advice, actually Phil's good advice again, said, you know what, I want to do this, but I want to do it mainly if it can be a real job. And it's kind of a small point now, but it was a little bit unusual at that time for a record label which employed, I don't know, somewhere between 30 and 50 people, I guess, mostly in promotion, production, publicity, various kinds of logistics relative to new releases, for them to want to build a staff of folks whose job was dealing with the catalog. So I was the overseer of that sector. It was called catalog development, and at its most robust, there were maybe 3 full-time people and a few part-time people who were involved in assembling the materials that were going to come out in these various reissues and other catalog development projects.
Okay, so you're the umbrella person for this.
Yes.
How do you pass out the work, and how do you see each of those little factors coming together?
There is 2 of the things were called research. So we actually called ourselves the research department because the issue, one of the factors is always trying to figure out what are the actual titles of these pieces that are to be reissued. What are the further details, like what are their identifiers, the matrix numbers we call for them. What's the circumstances for the recording. The discographical research is the big umbrella for that. You guys know this term, it gets used a lot. Discography meaning the study of the science part of records. What can be known, factually supported and known. So speaking with musicians was part of that. Speaking with the Copyright Office was a little bit of it, with publishing companies, with ASCAP and BMI, consulting the paper files for the record company, consulting record reviews, even looking at photographic evidence to try to figure out and to assemble the photographs that are going to be part of the package also. So those are all the strands of discographical research, not least that you actually listen to the darn record. Parenthetically, back in 1958, if your folks went to buy a record, they often had a choice of buying a mono record or a stereo record of the same recently recorded material.
That's right.
And the stereo record cost $1 more, but the tapes that were used to prepare those records had to be prepared separately, and there was always room for there to be a discrepancy. So some of what we were doing was actually listening through to make comparisons, listening to those in sync to see, is everything the same between the stereo and the mono, or between the early and the late, or between the European and the Mexican releases of these records, to sort of try to figure out.
Now, how would they have changed? You're talking about a post-production remix of these? Or what?
No, talking about, mostly not. The mix between stereo and mono was going to be different, and I suppose jazz people don't pay as much attention to that as the fans of Led Zeppelin and so on, who somehow feel like that's important. Editorial. But we were more concerned with finding new music. So take 6 versus take 4 being used of a certain piece. I mean, that's a simple assignment done in the studio for the producer to have written a ledger saying, these are the selections, these are the master takes, they would call them. Cut these into order in an LP master, and I'll listen to the ref of it and make sure it's good. That producer likely isn't going to listen to the ref of both the mono and the stereo to make sure they're the same, or maybe isn't going to notice if there were a tape discrepancy between one and the other.
I see.
So there's room for little slips like that. Maybe they're not all slips. Maybe sometimes it was intentional to say take 6 is no better or no worse than take 4. They both have really robust, great solos. Why wouldn't you put them both out? Yeah. So there's room for those things all the way along. And I guess I should also say that part of the discographical research is consulting with published sources and the people who assembled them, are nerds like me who've been on the case for years and years trying to figure out where exactly can the alternate takes, as we call them, the differing versions be found that could then be collected into the new product, because the new CD would say, here's the original 8 tracks, and here's 6 or 7 bonus tracks, right, that might be alternate takes issued elsewhere, or versions that stayed in the record company files unissued, that yet, upon reflection, could be of interest. It could be of some value, and certainly are of value in trying to get people to buy the record again who know it already. If it's the same as before, they might say, $17.99, maybe I'll go to dinner instead, right? But if it's got 3 new solos by Dizzy Gillespie, then, okay, fine, I'll buy it. That kind of thing.
So take me through the chronology. If we're looking at a decision that was made in management to go ahead and do a reissue, if you want to call it that, where do you start? Do you get into the vaults right away? Are you sitting in a booth somewhere with earphones and trying to decide what's happening? I mean, what's the chronology? How does this work?
Well, from the starting point, there is, thank goodness, there was a little bit of negotiation that we as the research staff were in on. So in other words, our input was solicited saying, hey, what should we put out this year? We'd say Charles Mingus and John Coltrane and, and interesting things like that. And they'd say, no, Sarah Vaughan, Tony Bennett, right, so on like this.
I see.
And, arrive at the list. And then to start the answer to your question, where it goes from there is to do a quick discographical survey of what's known in published sources like the comprehensive jazz discographies by Tom Lord and others, and say, what does the world know about this? Let's make sure we know at least as much as the world knows as we're starting, and then do the vault investigation to figure out, is it possible that there's 3 or 4 more reels of music that are bonus tracks or potential bonus tracks for that? And then if so, make sure and audition those really quickly. In a few cases, I think I put one on that list that you guys got of Ben Webster and Jerry Mulligan, or even that Charles Mingus Tijuana Moods from '57. Those are great examples of, there was a record's worth of material that came out, but there's another record's worth of material that is a parallel to that is not to be rejected. It just didn't happen to be the one that got selected. So you could build the master takes on one record and a bunch of alternative material, bonus material on the second one. So in some cases, the project had to be reconsidered right away, saying, wait a minute, this isn't a 1 CD, it's a 2 CD set. And how do you deal with that? Because that's a different price point. It's going to have different sales expectations and a bunch of stuff that, thank goodness, I was a little bit distant from, to be able to say, well, that's the best way to do this. And sometimes the answer was, let's do it less than best. Or let's do as much as we can do on 1 CD, knowing that it'll sink the ship if we go to 2 CDs. That not true for Louis Armstrong, not true for Webster and Mulligan, but 2 CDs of Lee Konitz. No offense, Mr. Konitz, the world's not going to beat down the door for that.
Well, let me ask for a point of clarification then. So when we're talking about you found in the vaults additional materials, are we talking about outtakes? Because that's an important consideration as well, especially from a research perspective, or even for fans to see how it might have been released. Or are we talking about brand new material, or a combination of both?
Combination of both for sure. In some cases, it's just patrolling the same supplemental sources that already have been used in maybe earlier reissues. Because remember, I joined up in the mid-'90s, by which time there was already a generation of jazz reissues on CD. So first thing you're doing is look at what was done on the old CD, sorry to bang the table, and then see, can we do at least as good as that, or better than, through the addition of any of these things. Other alternative versions are outtakes, meaning maybe a new performance that didn't make it to the record. Because remember, you could only get 40 minutes of music on a record, so if there were 60 minutes recorded for the project, they're going to set some aside, and that lies in the vault. But 60 minutes is a reasonable number for a CD, so you could come back and include that in.
I see.
But it's a little of everything. In some cases, it's there were a few reissues that involved bonus material, like Stan Getz did a soundtrack to a film with, what's his name? Warren Beatty in it, called Mickey 1 from 1964, and the bonus material we used for that was the alternative soundtrack versions, literally from the film, so taken off the digital version of the film. Dizzy Gillespie did a concert at the Museum of Modern Art in '61 where the concert was recorded and released. It was called An Electrifying Evening with Dizzy Gillespie, and part of the presentation at the museum was there was a little question and answer interview just like this, and the tape of that was in the library, so sure, why not put that out as a bonus item? So bonus items from all over the world, or all over the place, alternate takes, different performances, maybe even supplemental sessions if there was like a whole other date that didn't get used for some reason, maybe it could be pulled in. Interviews, what have you, a whole bunch of other stuff.
Wow. Well, so now when you're talking about going through the vaults, I mean, we're looking at recording studios. Well, first, Verve was bought by BMG or vice versa. RCA was...
Verve merged with
Sony.
Universal.
Universal.
And BMG and Sony were still independent when I was working with them.
I see.
And just after that, now they are unified as one conglomerate. Yeah.
So you had opportunity to actually go to the vaults of those individuals at that time. Must have been exciting as hell, man.
Yep. Yeah, well, it's exciting. I mean, it's that was what I had trained for, right? Was that kind of physical assessment of what's going on, looking at a reel and trying to deduce from the annotations on it, and certainly from the oral evidence, what the heck is this? What is this, and what does it say? And also studying how to rebuild the splices and the leaders in those tapes so that they're physically healthy. And I was rather more hands-on than many people are doing producing of that sort. So it actually was a thing for me to, roll up sleeves and go do the physical restoration of the tape on the way into the mastering process.
And let's discuss that in a little more detail. For those folks who are not familiar with analog recording techniques, because so much is digital,
Yep.
maybe you could describe. So this is what you would have in a studio, maybe 2-inch though, huh?
No, for me, not so much. I only worked on maybe 3 or 4 projects that were 2-inch tapes, because mostly my period and the classic period of jazz, if you say that's 1949, 1969, that's mostly just before multi-track tape comes in. So a 1/4 inch this width and 1/2 inch is twice this.
Yeah.
For mono, 2-track, 3-track, and 4-track, that's really most of my expertise. This is more like 8-track, and then the 2-inch tape is going to be 16 or 24. But where it was possible, I mean, that was the vision that I came into, was if we're going to do a definitive CD reissue, it needs to come from the original tape wherever that's possible. Some people disagree with that and will say, no. That 1969 mix was supervised by Creed Taylor or by, who's the Wall of Sound guy, Jerry, whoever those famous guys are. The one that was where the mix was supervised by a producer, that then is sacrosanct, and you want to always use that tape. The shortest explanation here is that, unlike in modern times when you make a digital copy of something, we see that as a lossless copy, or a very low degradation of sound, low level of degradation between the original digital version and making a digital copy of it. In analog times, there is a much greater loss of audio fidelity in making a copy from tape to tape. And that was the only way to do something. So in the natural production process, working from the original tape that you exposed at the studio to then copy it in order to cut something together into an LP master, where this would be the reel that matches side A of the record, that already was losing a generation. So wherever possible, if you can use what we call session tape that was exposed at the session, then you're better off. The bad news is, oftentimes the session tape does not reflect the editing that could have been done later, meaning in order to resequence the sound, physically cutting the tape to get the parts to match the head of take A to the tail of take B, right, and get these things to flow as one thing. And the part of the process was then knowing that there's going to be a whole new rebuild, surgical rebuild in the digital domain of what the edits were that were made to the tape in the process of originally making the record. Let's make it just like it was, but with better sound that derives from the original source material. Mm-hmm. So those, but back to your question, this, you can see it pretty, if you have this on the film, I don't know. This thing that's, it's a plain plastic strip of tape that has no magnetic component to it. In this hand, the white part is what they call leader tape, and it's used as a spacer and as a head and tail thing you can grab hold of. This dark line is the physical tape that has magnetic particles on it, and this is what is recordable on, so to speak. It's magnetic tape. So this thing that's joining them is a little piece of adhesive tape that's kind of like a Band-Aid or Scotch tape or whatever. It's equivalent to that. And the farther back you go, the splashier the technology is for that very thing. So it was a certainty that splices from the 50s, certainly from the 40s and even from the 60s, and really even from just 2 and 3 years ago, were going to bleed, as we say, meaning they're going to have an adhesive crust that oozes out and gets all over the nearby wines, and then the process of getting the tape prepped is going in with trichloral trifluoroethane or with grain alcohol or whatever it is and a Q-tip to physically take off those bits so they don't hang up the tape and cause a jump in time as it's playing, or don't rip the oxide off as it's unwinding.
Yeah.
So that, and I don't know, I pray that people who are doing this still have the kind of, if I may say so, religious devotion to that craft that we used to, because it's really important. Now there's a viewpoint that says, we'll clean it up in post, right? We'll clean it up in digital. Go ahead and let the noises get into the playback of the tape, because we can, synthesize something or do the error correction later. I'm not from that school at all. You can do the error correction later, but why not get it right the first time so that the tape is strong and healthy right now for use and also for years to come. So that was a large part of like sniffing those chemicals day by day by day to get these tapes to wind right so that they would play right, so we could get the best sound off of them. And that's
what a skill that takes in order for that to happen, man. I could recall being in studios, when I was recording and watching back in that day, someone would literally with the razor and splicing the tape and taping it together and hoping that they got exactly that right point.
Well, hoping, and then if first you don't succeed, try again. Yeah. It is a little bit, restoration engineering is a little bit different from editing, right? Because we weren't making physical edits to the tape that was supposed to last. We were just cleaning up the earlier edits that had been made and trying to represent those, or trying to make sense of them.
Yeah. Wow.
There is, and I will say there's, so that like if you, in the outline, you'd say Roman numeral 1 or letter A, capital A is discographical research and capital B is tape research. Actually looking at, listening to the tapes, and in many cases trying to figure out, well, I got 2 tapes that are roughly the same content. It could be that this is the parent and this is the child, or vice versa. How are you going to know? And that's about listening, right? And the audio forensic part of being able to hear what has the crystalline biting character, the transients, right, active from the original recording, and what is going to have that dulled character of what a dub sounds like, what a copy sounds like, where it's going to lose a little bit of that high end.
Sure.
So that was part of it, and along the way, there's a pretty good example, if you guys care to pursue it. There was a science of CD making 20 years ago that people cared about that we lost track of very quickly. I wonder if you know about it, called index points.
I've heard of
where
this.
Within a track you can sort of put a digital marker that'll show on some machines, so it'll show that you're reading track 3, but from the beginning it's index 1, and then at a certain point index 1 goes to index 2. It's kind of like putting in an indentation or a paragraph marker that goes off as people are watching the CD. It was a common thing, in the early 90s for classical people to do that and say, symphony number 1 is track 2, movement 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, or within the opera, these various little stanzas or acts or whatever would be given index points. And that was a thing where it was, the vision that I came from was, let's try to use this catalog development thing as a teaching tool to help people understand better what's going on. So, in cases like in that Charles Mingus record, Pre-Bird, there's a tune in, 16/8? No, I think it's 16/8, where he plays this introduction, and then so on like that. The entrance of the tenor player, Yusef Lateef, was actually, as we found out from looking at the tape and restoring the original tape, was the amalgamation of like 6 different pieces of tape within 1 second. So at 15 inches per second, that's about this long for 1 second. And you could see all these cuts, and you wag your head and say, damn it, Charles Mingus, that's exactly what he would do in pursuit of that perfection, is sit there and glower at the guy who's doing the cutting and say, no, we want this 8th note to come from this take, then this one, then this one. If you hear it naturally, it sounds like Yusef played it that way. But to examine it, you notice, no, it's actually 6 different things. So if you watch ours go by, you're playing track 2 is what it is, and then it goes from index 1 to index 5 within about 1 second, because each of those points is indexed to be able to say, okay,
yeah.
we're telling the people of the future, this is what the process was in the original assembling of that record.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what I was saying before about the excitement of just handling some of this material, it was
Yeah.
the original. It's in the day.
It's a job that people want.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that everybody wants to sniff the glue quite as much as they should. But I mean, hopefully it's a responsibility as well as a thing that you want to do.
Sure. So I'm wondering, a lot of these pre-recorded pieces that are now being released, I guess I'll try to change my terminology, but a lot of it is packaged in such a different way, and I wonder how much of that actually has to do with the demographics, the sales folks trying to get a sense of where the demographics lie on this, and what would be of interest. I know many of them are being released with really large books that may contain a lot of historical data, photographs, things of that nature that are very exciting to look at, but it also increases the price considerably on many of those. So where does that fall in the chain? Is that something that's happening simultaneously? Some of your research actually fall into those accompanying books and liner notes, if you will?
Yeah, in a lot of cases, some of the projects that I worked on, some that are on that list, are boxed editions, multiple CD things, 16 or 10 or 5 or 6 CDs. And if you're going to sell 6 CDs, the price will go from $17.99 to suddenly it's $70 or $80 or $100 or whatever. And with that, there's a little bit more latitude in the packaging. And one would expect also, if a consumer is buying those CDs, then we would think that person is expecting a little bit of additional value to it somehow, from exactly what you've said. Something good to read, something good to look at, something new, right? And that means you've got a little bit of extra budget to work with to commission writers to write more, and maybe even 2 or 3 different essays, maybe have an essay by somebody who was there at the session, maybe reprint some material from published at the time, like record reviews and stuff like that, and surely to get new photographs and maybe even candid photographs of some of the artifacts like what you've got here. Yeah. There is a constant tug of war between the graphics people and the art people and the science people or the discographically minded, where I came from the viewpoint saying, ugly or pretty, it's got to be clear, right? And they would always say, clear schmear, it's got to be sexy, right? Or whatever. Or, somewhere up above all of us is somebody who's saying pretty much about the demographics, what you're saying. We want to sell this to the citizens of the 21st century, and therefore it'll be useful to have this crusty old codger show up in a new design, right? Something that's a contemporary design.
So not the original artwork, not the original liner notes. Where does that fall? Because that's got to be a lot of argument going on.
In most cases, the title reissues, where you're putting out just one record that I was involved in, would definitely reproduce the original liner notes, sometimes in a legible form and sometimes in an image that shrunk to this proportion from 12 by 12, how it started out. The latter is a little bit, it's not giving full justice to the text of it, but original liner notes and also an updated viewpoint, which is saying exactly the same thing. Like we're saying, here's this record from 1961 that's worth hearing, and here's a new look at it by way of bonus material. So that new look in music was represented by a new look in an essay where somebody was able to make sense of that and say, aha, here's what the original means 50 years later, and here's what it means to have this supplemental audio, that's going to make it sound better.
Yeah. What about the actual cover? I mean, that was a big selling point. That artwork was incredible, and photography and so forth.
Yeah.
Is that normally used?
Yeah, normally yes. And most of the things I worked on were in series where the notion was to say, okay, we want to have, let's say this is the original cover, and we want to have it sort of bracketed, like shrunk slightly but still visible with a border where the series has continuity of design around this outer border. So maybe it's like funny stripes, or maybe it's like special color or something like that, or in some cases it was like tilted to say, to grab the attention of people who would recognize that art, but also let people know this is a fancy new version that is not to be confused with just a simple replica of the thing that you know.
And that brings me to my next question, which is, what proportion of this are we talking about that comes out in vinyl, and how much comes out in CDs, or do you actually do both simultaneously?
Well, it's interesting. When I was working for other people at Verve and at BMG, everything was CDs. The vinyl the new wave of attention to vinyl reissues had not hit yet. So in that period, I didn't work on anything that was going to become a record. Starting in 2009, doing my own things, independent on Triple Point Records, the vision was everything will be vinyl because it's going to be trusted, more easily trusted to last longer.
Okay, so I did want to, that's my very next question, Triple Point Records. Okay, so you started this nonprofit label, and you had a vision for where this needs to go. You're doing some reissues, but also some brand new recordings. So let's talk about that.
It really started just completely through the back door with, I as a researcher dealing with people like Roswell Rudd and Cecil Taylor and Bill Dixon, I was in touch with so many juicy and wonderful and instructive musical examples that had not been released that would be instructive to sort of, put into the canon one way or another. And having worked for other companies and sort of sharpened these skills, I knew what that was about, and knew also that there were sometimes you could peddle, meaning make a deal with a larger company to want to be interested in that, and sometimes they were never going to be interested. So sometimes you sort of take the matter into your own hands and find a way to own the means of production. So that was really what gave birth to this, was saying, as soon as nobody wanted to, there was a recording we did of Cecil Taylor and Tony Oxley at the Village Vanguard in 2008, and nobody wanted it for the prices that Mr. Taylor and Mr. Oxley wanted to get paid for it. So it was sort of an alternative, mathematics on a napkin on a bar top that said, hey, what about this? Why couldn't we do this ourselves, myself and my colleague Joe Lizzi? And the answer was, yeah, let's give it a shot. And through much travail, that actually happened. And slowly there's been a chain of other projects with exactly the same principle of here's some important music that is valuable enough artistically that it needs to be heard forever, and throwing the dice a little bit on, is it valuable enough that people are going to pay what it takes to make a record, which is rather more expensive than making CDs, and what it takes to make a sort of enhanced package such as we make that tries to usually tell the whole story.
That's right. Yeah.
You can tell I'm a whole story kind of guy.
Well, yeah. And your products are just gorgeous, man. It's beautiful.
Well, that's the thing. Hopefully, we're certainly from that viewpoint that if it's worth putting out, if it's worth putting the effort into, then it's worth doing it right, and trying to make it so that it can be an attractive item in addition to being a thorough, item.
Yeah. So this next question I have for you is a little bit out of your purview, actually, I think, but you may be able to shed some light on this. You had done reissues of Ella Fitzgerald or Louis Armstrong and so forth. How do you get the rights to that material, given the fact that, of course, it's pre-recorded, it's sitting in a vault? Who actually owns that and owns the rights, and especially if you're doing a resale of this material?
Yeah. It is complex, or there are several different compartments that apply to, or not compartments, but different paradigms, I guess the way to say it, that apply in various cases. To take Ella Fitzgerald and Armstrong, Fitzgerald was a Verve contract artist, so she was under contract from 1956 to 1967, something like that. Yeah, something like that. Saying every record that she was going to put out was going to come out on Verve. And so Verve would own everything that they did, whether it was released or not. The deal had already been made with her, so she was, a contract artist. And the labels, I mean, that's part of why catalog development is considered sort of a cash cow item these days, because to be candid about it, the fees that were given to artists in their times were not particularly handsome, and yet she was paid everything she needed to be paid for that project. Likewise, the musicians were paid for having done the session. So whether it came out or not, this music that was made in 1957, there's a good example of this is that thing just came out a couple of years ago. Ella's at a place in Hollywood, has a Z in it. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of it, but several nights of recording at this club. And that was sitting in the Verve vaults forever. There were a lot of other Fitzgerald things to deal with, so that didn't get done until just a couple of years ago. Zardy's? I think it's at Zardy's, I hope. Anyway, so that was already paid out, and it was just for the label to say, let's just cash in on this right away, knowing that the deal had already been made.
So residuals weren't part of the original contracts back in the day?
Not generally, they were not.
Yeah.
Or whatever it was just tiny anyway. 5% was enormous back then, and much more likely it wasn't built into those contracts. Ella Fitzgerald was... her contract was written by a guy who loved what she did and was very even-handed with everything, and he managed her career. This guy, Norman Granz, who started Verve, managed her career even after she was a Verve artist. So undoubtedly, he got what he could. He did the best for her that could be done. But to my knowledge, and this is after my time, a lot of the Ella Fitzgerald projects did not need a further sign-off from Ella Fitzgerald or her estate, in order to do that. Now, when I was at BMG, and this is still a thing, Sonny Rollins, the saxophone colossus of our time, made 30 hours of music for RCA that you guys don't know about, and I've only heard in passing while it was being considered, hey, and now is the time to go dig up all the supplemental material that's around the bridge and What's New and all these other records, and Our Man in Jazz, bonus everywhere. And I believe either because of a contractual obligation or just trying to be nice to Sonny Rollins, he has been given, or his wishes have been respected, that those things should not be put out right now. And that's been true for 20 years, probably more like 30 years, and maybe it'll go all the way until Rollins is gone, and can continue to say no to it, to say, no, I don't want those to come out. You've got enough of what I do.
I see, yeah. Yeah, and there's so much material now that's being discovered. The Coltrane, of course, that gigantic package. I think Ravi produced that, right? His son, Ravi?
Sure.
Yeah. But also the Eric Dolphy material that's out now. The new, what is it called? New reissued studio recordings.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is the Music Prophet I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
63, that was recorded. Here it is.
One hopes, and this is the other part of the answer to your question, I'll try to be quick about it. One hopes that for a record where there hasn't been a payment made already, meaning like Eric Dolphy's Illinois concert that came out, 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. That was just a concert. It was well enough recorded that it was a viable prospect for being released as a record. But Dolphy was an AFM member, and everybody on that record day, J.C. Moses and Herbie Hancock, whoever else, they're American Federation of Musicians union members, so they've got to be paid for it. And the ethics of our industry would say you should be paid if a thing is being released for the first time or considered for release for the first time. Mm-hmm. And so that becomes a little bit of a negotiation where the parsimonious answer of the record companies often is, well, let's just give them what union scale is, because it's basically like one record date. So you get, J.C. Moses' estate would get $361 or whatever for making that date. And Eric Dolphy would get double as leader, so he'd get $700. Now, we wince, right? We cringe thinking that that's how it goes, because no, that's Eric Dolphy's music, and his prowess is what's being used to sell that record. Yeah, so surely he's entitled to get paid a handsome amount, like $6,000 or $8,000 or $15,000 or $20,000, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And that's for them to know and us to not know, but only speculate and say, you would hope that people are being taken care of, and the musicians and their estates are being taken care of in appropriate ways. And same for the recent Eric Dolphy release.
Yeah.
In the case of the Coltrane thing, the Coltrane family is in control of not necessarily everything, but very, very much of the bonus material or the additional recordings that are going to come out in our lifetimes from the Coltrane world. And they're being very strategic, and the paths are their paths of like, this will be what comes out now, and when there's something else to come out, we'll tell you about it, or we'll make it available to you. That kind of thing.
Yeah. Name recognizability must factor into this very heavily in terms of marketing and all of that. I got the Monk tapes from '63 that are out. There's some remarkable material that was just never mined,
Yeah.
So here it is. But I guess my last question to you has everything to do with, it's a big question mark. Why? The market for jazz has shrunk remarkably.
Yep.
We're going back and mining out older material. The newer market appears to be, or the new model, let's say, appears to be that current jazz musicians are just giving their materials away online. And so they're not looking at this as a marketable product, and rather just a way to enhance their performance careers. And here we have a product in hand, something tangible, quite different, that we're looking to market. But to whom? Where are we pointing to try to get people to make the purchase and make the investment in these?
I got to tell you, it's been my great pleasure in the record business to be at the other end of the hall from the marketing offices. And I interface with those people, and I understand what they do. I don't necessarily get along with them. And a lot of the strategy that goes into the marketing part has to do with looking at what is the world looking at, and then posing the question, what jazz things do we have that could be brought into that, right? That could be made to look like, okay, the world is caring about this movie that just became a thing, or suddenly the world likes bluegrass because of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? So it's like, what if we say this is the Oh Jazz, Where Art Thou? Nonsense ideas like this.
Yeah.
That's a large driver for trying to fit in an advertising kind of way, trying to fit these things in there. I go completely the opposite way, and again, this is part of my upbringing to say we are completely the loss of market share for jazz owes to the loss of listenership, and the loss of listenership owes to the fact that we're not paying attention to jazz, and that's where whatever the cause is of that surely is the effect. And so to me, most of the things that I've been involved in that we talked about last time, doing radio, doing teaching, doing writing, doing reissues, this is all the same mission of like, let's get more people to care about and understand the nuance of this art form, right? Mm-hmm. So from that perspective, I think you do the records over here and have the records tell their own story, right, by the packaging issues that we're talking about, and trying to be as crisp and accessible and realistic as possible, and to glorify those art pieces, while at the other side saying, by the way, you should learn something about art so that you know how this item fits into the whole spectrum, the whole panoply of human creativity, right? We got to teach that part of the creativity. So that's where like those courses you were naming, Jazz 101 and 201 and so on, that's trying to fertilize the field so that there will be a knowledgeable listening public that can sensibly receive these things and hopefully come out and actually spend some money, or spend time, most importantly, but maybe spend some money also to buy into those projects.
Yeah. I have to tell you that your holistic view has really impacted my thinking as well, because I know that you're someone who not only is passionate about recording and preservation work, but education and everything else you've been doing, man. Your authoring of articles, books, lectures. It's all with that sort of global view, that holistic view, that folks just need to know about this American art form that's revered internationally And many times, in many countries, of course, we know, supported financially. And yet here in the States, it is
Yeah.
less than appreciated, let's say. So,
Yeah. I think it's, I'll say a word that'll wake people up. It must be very much like making beer. That like you guys know some cats who make beer, or at least some people who drink beer. Like beer? Everybody's like beer? If you're into beer, not saying I am, and I'm not advocating this for you guys, but if you're into beer, you're gonna go from drinking it to finding out what is it that makes this one better than that one. And very many people, surprisingly many, go upstream and say, oh, I'm gonna make that. As soon as you start making it, you start to examine what are the ingredients, how do you make it? And they say, whoa, harvest. I never thought about harvesting. So I'm gonna think about growing those hops, right? And then once you're thinking about growing the hops, then you think about, well, they grow better in this kind of dirt, in these circumstances, than in that kind of dirt. And you just keep going all the way upstream, right? And it is surprising how many people do that. And actually, and you know, when they're talking on cooking shows about like understand the difference between the purple endive and Belgian endive or whatever, you're gonna go upstream and say, how does this one grow and how does that one grow? And pretty soon you're growing your own stuff. So I think the holistic part of it, we have many, many examples of, you know, and you're totally right. I'm just trying to plug those same circumstances into how we could understand jazz.
yeah, wonderful, man. Well, I tell you, I'm honored you're here. I will buy you a beer of your choice.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is coffee. This is a bean product.
A bean product. Man, thanks for taking the time, pal.
It's a pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure, yeah.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you. All right.
Doing great too. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you for doing the good thing.